Welcome. This is Rising from the Ashes. I'm Anna Klint, your guide here to help you transform 2020's painful lessons into deep healing for you and the planet. I am thrilled and honored to be sitting here today with Melanie Goodchild. Melanie is Moose Clan from the Anishinaabe Ojibway Nation. She is the founder of Turtle Island Institute, which is a global Indigenous social innovation think and do tank. Not just thinking, but doing. I love that. She's a PhD candidate in social and ecological sustainability and a faculty member with the Academy for Systems Change. Melanie, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, good, Anna. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you today.
The pleasure is mine as well. So, okay, one question I'm just asking everybody. If you had one word to describe the year 2020, what would it be?
One word to describe 2020. I think my word would be Gichiga Kinuamatuin, which is an Anishinaabe word. Anishinaabe Moin is the language of my ancestors, and it's a noun, actually. It's a verb. And we tend to think of a lot of words as nouns in English when we're speaking in English. But this is a word I learned this year, and it means the act of great or deep teaching.
Ooh.
Yeah, I was trying to define kind of some of the work that I do. And I was speaking with my sister, Eleanor Skeed from Ojibway, she's Anishinaabe. And I said, it's about teaching, it's about learning. And she says, I think it is the act of great or deep teaching. So for me, 2020 has been a process of really sitting deeply in the act of great or deep teaching. So
That's beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of opportunity for deep learning.
Yeah, whether we like it or not. It is definitely.
Yeah.
Why that word, I think, came to my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you suppose this year came to pass in this way? You know, that this was this opportunity. Why now?
You know, from the kind of multiple Indigenous perspectives, there is a time that has arrived that was a time of prophecy. And so there are a number of Indigenous nations around the world that have prophesied that there would be a time. In my culture, we call it the seventh fire prophecy. The time that we're in now actually is the eighth fire. So the seventh fire prophecy would be a time when we would reconnect with the earth. We would share our ways of knowing with each other. So the people from all four directions, so not just the Indigenous, that it would be people from all over the world would go back to their ancestral teachings and that they would share. And we would do that as well, because we're recovering, from hundreds of years of settler colonialism and attempted genocide. And so there's a long recovery process for that.
Yeah.
And we've been, relying on our ceremonies and our cultural teachings and practices to help us cope with that. And I think that the time that was prophesied would be that we would go through a very difficult time and that we would come out of that. And for us, that difficult time is actually the, hundreds of years of trauma that we've experienced in the process of settler colonialism.
Yeah.
But this time that we're in right now, the year of 2020, is kind of a capstone event in the sense that it's having the world slow down. And having us really deeply understand that interconnected, when we say all my relations, and Dinawamag and Aduk, that's all my relatives. When we say that, it's not a simple idea. It's actually quite profound and complex that the world is interconnected. And I think 2020 in many ways has shown us how we are living in the world together, that we are together in the river of life. And now the river of life, and this is a Haudenosaunee teaching from the Two-War Wampum Belt. And I'm here in Niagara Falls, Ontario, which is traditional Haudenosaunee, Three Fires Confederacy territory. And whether it's Anishinaabe, Mohawk, Hopi, Blackfoot, we all have prophecies that we would go through these cycles. And this is the cycle that we're in right now, where Mother Earth has taken time to breathe. You know, like in 2020, I saw coyotes and mallards and ducks and geese walking down my street.
Wow.
Because the humans were all inside.
Yeah.
And so Mother Earth did take a really deep breath this year too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So who are we being asked to become, like, through this prophecy, through this deep teaching that is being laid out before us? And, you know, you mentioned going back to ancestral teachings. To what end? For what purpose? Who are we being asked to become through this trial of 2020?
You know, when I talk about ancestral teachings and prophecies and returning to ancestral teachings, I'm actually talking about not only Indigenous peoples, but people from all over the world. That there was a time where we were all very connected to the earth.
Yes.
So industrialization and modernity, it swept all of us up into this kind of disconnection from food systems, you know, from the earth, from medicines that came from the land, from the teachings of the animals, because we don't see them anymore. We destroy them. We've encroached on their habitat. How can we understand teachings that come from the buffalo if we don't see them, from the bears and from, you know, the Maingan, which are the wolves, and the Makwa, the bear? How do we actually connect with all that Mother Earth provided for us many years ago, when we have disconnected and decoupled that from our own existence?
Yes.
And so I think that's what we're being asked to do, is to reconnect. I've heard people say, fall back in love with Mother Earth, to, you know, understand that we are a part of the systems that we're seeking to change. It's not like some system over there. You know, it's easy for us to sort of find the bad guy in the story, but really we're all inhabiting this planet together as humanity with all of our relatives. And so the question that we're being asked, I think, to answer is, what are we doing for the unborn generations?
Yeah.
What are we doing to be good ancestors? Because our ancestors all collectively around the world survived what they thought was the end of the world. I'm sure in many respects, as soon as our people were put on reservations,
Yeah.
I'm sure my ancestors thought that was the end of the world as we knew it. But here I am, surviving, thriving, experiencing and teaching my own culture because of what they did to protect it. So what are we doing to protect, you know, our core values for future generations?
I love that question. Like, what are we doing to be good ancestors? It really shifts our perspective, even, you know, for all of us, even if we don't have kids, you know, to that we're going to have direct descendants in that way. This idea of like, oh yeah, it doesn't just stop with me. Like, there's a legacy that each one of us is going to leave. And what I'm hearing you say is, what kind of legacy do we want that to be?
Yeah. And it's, you know, that's kind of me channeling what the elders ask me all the time about my work, you know, is, what are you doing for the unborn generations? What are you doing to support the continuation of life on this planet for all beings, not just us? And so there's there's teachings within our language systems, within our ceremonies and songs, that teach us reciprocity, sustainability, that teach us about humility. Even our creation story teaches us that we were the last beings put on the back of the turtle island. And as the last beings, we are the youngest siblings of all of our relations. And so really, you know, when I see things like definitions, for example, of sustainability, it's often very anthropocentric. There's a bias there that, you know, human beings are the center of the universe. But in our culture, we are spirit beings on a human journey, and there are other spirit beings on their, you know, physical journeys here. And we are all equal but different. And so it's different to think of the wind or the sun or the water as your relative than it is to think of it as a noun, as an it, as inanimate, or as a natural resource. You know, we don't have a word like that in our language, natural resource. What we say is, we say Gidakimanan, it means everything, everything in creation. So in our language, we don't have a word for nature or wildlife, wilderness, as if those are separate things that need to get named. No,
Right.
we say Kedakimanan, it's everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really struck by this idea, for someone who, and I have a fairly strong nature connection, I still don't think of the wind as my relative. And that just really strikes me as like a paradigm shift to, most of the time I go outside. I live in New Mexico. It's quite windy sometimes. And it's quite gritty because, it's high desert. It's quite sandy here. So sometimes the wind can bring unwelcome, grit into your face. And this is a total paradigm shift to think of the wind as my relative, and the sun and the water and the moon. It's really, there's this chronic sense of not belonging that I see in my community, have seen it within myself and my family and the people that I work with. It's at a very deep level, this disconnection. And there's so many reasons for it. A lot of it is sociological, the way that we raise children, and if you subscribe to attachment disorder and things like this. There's so many reasons why we can say that there's this rampant sense of not belonging. And as I'm talking about the wind as my relative, as I'm thinking about how I notice the moon as it moves overhead, it's hard to feel like you don't belong if those are your relatives.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a whole different sense of your place in the world, which is really empowering and honestly quite beautiful and poetic. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a beautiful teaching that, when we share stories or ideas, the elders always say that you take what you need and you leave what you don't. And
Totally.
so share stories, because we are an oral culture. I mean, we wrote things down. We had birch bark scrolls, and we had art, but the oral culture is that you're repeating those stories. That you're sharing the creation story, for example, and they would recite that and repeat that and teach you. And so from the time that you were young until you were much older, you heard that story hundreds of times. And that was disrupted,
Yeah.
With all that happened in our communities. And so I think that's really special to be able to hear the creation story from the elders, and to know your place in creation, because that gives you your sense of identity,
Mm-hmm.
who you are, your clan, your name, your spirit name. All of those things teach you, who you're related to and who your spirit helpers are, and that's a huge part of knowing, what you're going to be offering to the world as your gift.
Yeah. And that's really like the crux of it. I mean, I feel like this is what we are supposed to be doing, is figuring out exactly what those gifts are and healing the obstacles to sharing them.
Yeah.
And how can the ancestors support us in an endeavor such as that?
Mm-hmm. When I get frustrated, I've been doing kind of social justice, systems change, anti-racism work, environmental work for a long time. And when I start whining, thinking about how hard that journey is, my uncle Dan Longboat, who's Haudenosaunee, my spiritually adopted uncle, it's Mohawk, he says, never forget that you come from a people that have the power to summon the very thunder beings from the sky by offering tobacco,
Yeah.
and you put your tobacco down, and then you hear thunder and lightning, and see the lightning, and those are thunder beings. That's who we're related to. And so there are, many different teachings within Indigenous cultures around the world about those types of connections. And he said, don't forget that is your legacy. That's your, what's in your DNA. So while we talk about intergenerational trauma,
Mm-hmm.
as residing in at the cellular level in your DNA. So there is multi-generational, intergenerational trauma. There's
Yes.
also intergenerational resilience, right? And so he talks about, and he's the one that reminds me, your ancestors, thought the world was ending at one point too, like we felt this year. So much going on and so much, grief happening. It becomes overwhelming, and
Yes.
you're already living, in a society where there's grief and anxiety. This was heightened this year to a level that I don't think many of us were prepared for.
Yeah.
So the ancestors that we all have survived brutal times. I mean, we have gone through cycles like this before. And so now it's about, what do we do when we come out the other side? Like, whatever that is, whatever that looks like, are we going to go back to the consumption patterns we had, to the disconnections that we had? The polarization continues. Are we going to go back to that? Or are we going to take this time to breathe and sit still as an opportunity to reevaluate that, and people have talked about it. They said, oh, well, since I've been in quarantine, I've done certain things, or I've shopped local, or I've, done things in a local sense. But is that going to shift, when we can go back to what resembles, I guess, normal, whatever that looks like, that snapback risk,
Yeah.
I think that's what we also need to think about.
How do we, humans are creatures of habit. And so how do we change those old, that's the old paradigm? And how do we, I mean, obviously it's a choice. We can continue to, make a choice to shop local and to do those things. But in so many ways, we're entrenched in certain systems that are not really serving us. How do we, on an individual level, be a person who changes systems? How do we bring it down to that, something that the average person can say, yeah, the system isn't working. What do I do?
I think one thing is, from an Anishinaabe perspective, is to understand that everything has a spirit. And when you understand that COVID-19 as a pandemic there's a spirit there. It is, the world is made up of spirituality. I mean, the closest thing I think in Western science that we have is quantum physics, and David Bohm's work on the quantum potential, that that's science trying to prove something. From our perspective, the proof is already there. We see and feel a collective global consciousness, for example. We see and feel the spirit, that things are in flux. We understand that there's emergent properties of systems. And I think for individuals, we've been socialized to actually think in a reductive way. We've been socialized not to be systems thinkers. We've been socialized through school, through the media, all kinds of things, that influence kind of how we look at the world. And, I heard a teacher of mine who takes people on learning journeys as part of his systems change work. And he says, we tend to go through the world thinking that we are illuminating what we are seeing, but instead we are projecting.
Yeah, totally.
Never, forgotten that, where I thought, and at that time we were actually touring an organic farm. And he said, I just encourage you, he's taking a group of us, to think about what you are seeing, and instead of projecting, try to illuminate. So from an individual perspective, I think that's something we can do. Like, because people tend to really jump into their judgments, looking at their own, bounded rationality. I'm going to set the limits. This is what I think of this. This is how I define it. If you're open to multiple ways of knowing, there's a Hawaiian scholar that talks about epistemic violence within institutions. And what that is you can bring multiple different looking people, like equity and diversity work. You can bring Black and brown people and ask them to work for you, or hire them, or put them on a board, ask them to be on a board. But when we arrive, we're vilified, because it isn't just about equity and diversity from a compliance perspective. It's actually about opening yourself up to different ways of knowing and seeing the world, different cosmologies. And as soon as I'm thinking that, like, as a graduate student, or someone who works with different institutions, everybody's really excited. Let's have an Indigenous person or a Black person, or a woman join this board, except they have to act like everybody else. Mm-hmm. And I think from an individual perspective, that's what you can do is sort of shift your mental models or your mindsets. And that's hard work. It is really challenging work.
Yeah, that requires a great deal of self-awareness, actually, to be able to see how you yourself are participating in a system, and whether that system is the relational aspects of you inside your home, or how you are relating to the people in the world. I think of the grocery store because it's the only place we can go to right now. Everything is closed, and really having a whole lot of self-awareness, which then gets sticky, because then sometimes we can start to see things that don't always feel very good, or like we can start to see our complicity in these systems, but there's no way to change it while your head's in the sand. So I love that. That's just really allowing ourselves, what I'm hearing you say is just allowing ourselves to maybe drop as much as we can, which is a process and a practice of the expectations that we have of what we're going to see and experience based on, a conversation with another person, for instance, and rather than projecting what we anticipate, saying, I wonder how this might be different if I saw something I'd never saw before. It is a lot of work.
It's challenging not to be defensive if you get called out on privilege, or called out on that's a narrow point of view that you're holding, because your ego doesn't want to be embarrassed and told that it needs to do some work, but the elders definitely talk about that you have to do your work, and that coming into contact with your source, your center, your being, all of that is challenging. And that's why you ask for help. That's why you ask for help in ceremonies, or you ask for processes that can help you do that in a good way, so that you're not harmed by that process.
Right. That's brilliant. To really embrace a system of support around doing the work, so that it doesn't add more trauma to the trauma that's already there, that's causing the lens to be in place, that's causing the ego to be on alert, that's causing the perspective to be projected. Yeah, that's really brilliant. My sense from what I know about your work is that some of the thinking and the doing in the tank is this community-based work, where my sense is that it's a space where you can be at once challenged and also supported and held. Is that?
It is, yeah. We've been, kind of experimenting, I guess you could say, exploring, trying different ways to build community and to support people, to focus on systemic transformations, or, kind of uplifting communities, uplifting marginalized peoples, to do that from a place that centers healing self and systems. And the really clear link between inner work and outer work in that type, because systems work can be, which is what I do, it can be very academic in some ways. There's a lot of theories, and they're interesting and useful, which really keeps you in your head. So we try to design everything using our teaching of the medicine wheel, which is a human being is made up of spirit, mental, physical, and emotional. And so we'll check ourselves against, almost like those are indicators. The elders call them frequencies. So how do you tap into your spiritual frequency, or the spiritual frequency of systems. How do you tap into physical? And so we're exploring all of those. We're practicing Qigong, which my husband Sly is a certified instructor, which is an Eastern tradition. We are doing tea ceremonies. We are doing our ceremonies where we smudge and we feast and invite people into conversation. And so we're really trying to look after ourselves in the way that we define Anishinaabe Mina Bomatsuin, which is the good life, is that you are in balance. So wellness is looked at more from the presence of well-being than it is from the absence of disease. And so, contemporary Western healthcare focuses on illness. And and there are illnesses, but if it was more holistic, right, that's what preventative medicine is. And it's the original ways that we heal. It's not for us alternative medicine, although it might get labeled that. But really, traditional healing and our spiritual practices are what helped us cope historically and continue to help us cope with what's going on in the world, which is such a complex place now. That we need to nurture those practices. And that's what we try to do. I try to nurture the reawakening of spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional ways of engaging with the world and understanding it and kind of making sense of it and meaning making. All of that happens within that medicine wheel framework.
I love that. It's also like a really wonderful framework to think about human consciousness, right? It's like in certain aspects, we may have really elevated our consciousness to a certain level of, embracing, for instance, our interconnectedness and our oneness. But in other areas of our life, and that could be in the spiritual and then in the physical, we're still feeling disconnected. And so to think about how we ourselves can nourish all those aspects of ourselves and develop and like systems for resilience as well as expansion, as well as growth. And I love this, healing this, as a model for healing self is to have a sensitivity to us as these complex beings. And then for your work to transpose that onto everything outside is just a really beautiful model for kind of engaging with the work in general. It's beautiful. So I love what you're saying too. The good life is a life of balance, as opposed to, an excess of only quote unquote good things. It's like, well, no, it's actually embracing all of it and feeling in the mix and in the flow with it.
It is, yeah. And I think that's an important lesson when we think about some of our ceremonies, they like fasting or sun dancing ceremonies of other nations. There's an element of suffering and sacrifice there because it elevates transcendence, right? It elevates that connection, that connection that you can have if you don't drink or eat for a number of days, so that you can really, kind of get in touch with a more spiritual reality or a spiritual realm. And I think that suffering is an opportunity for growth. You don't feel like it. When you're grieving, for example, I do a lot of work that folks realize in talking about healing self and systems that they have unresolved grief.
Yes.
And it's till it's kind of made visible to you, including, I think, the grief that we all experience from the disconnection from the land, that we then become overwhelmed by the grief and start to feel it. And it's a very uncomfortable feeling. It's sad, it's overwhelming,
Yes.
grief is not fun, but that you process that. And we have different ceremonies and teachings, but there are ways that people can process that. I've heard it described as kind of like you have to ingest it. It has to go through your system, right to the cellular level, and then you have to have an outlet for it. And so that's why somatic practices, are so important. And if we all had an opportunity to live a more balanced life and to make that a part of our everyday kind of reality, but it's difficult because that's not what's rewarded in the system, like the economic system. Productivity is rewarded, it's sitting here and having a conversation about states of consciousness is not what's rewarded typically. It's like, what did you produce? Did you write a report today?
So
Yeah, that's, you know, I think an important aspect of ceremonies is that you learn from the sacrifice and suffering. And, you know, so what are we going to learn from this year? And that's, you know, why Gichiga Kinu Amatawin, the act of great or deep teaching, that we are being taught and potentially we are going to teach. Maybe that's how we become good ancestors, is to teach about what we've learned from this experience, and how whatever lies ahead of us, you know.
Yeah, that's a beautiful image. Um, my sense is that I love that you're presencing grief and collective grief. I have a really strong sense that 2020 served to highlight how much unprocessed grief we actually are carrying around with us. And that that came through in like the sense of hopelessness that would cycle through the collective. It wasn't hopeless all the time, but sometimes it felt pretty hopeless. A sense of scarcity, of fear. And I'm curious, like I'm curious if you have the same sensibility about this unprocessed grief, and 2020 really shining a light on that.
Yeah, you know, I have the opportunity and privilege to sit in a lot of different communities where we surface grief, you know, because of the sort of methodologies that we have, and getting people to talk about their life journey. I talk about their Minigojawin, so their sacred knowledge bundle. And so, you know, typically when you introduce yourself, you might say, this is my name, this is where I'm from, this is my title. But if you invite people to bring their full self into the conversation from the beginning, they start to, like, if you ask them about their purpose, their calling, their passion. But if I often will ask people, speak to me, please, about your Minigoshuin, which is that which is gifted to you. And it is your sacred knowledge bundle that you carry. And what's in your knowledge bundle? Who contributed? Where did those gifts come from? And I've heard people reflect back, that's the first time I got to talk about my grandmother. That's the first time I got to talk about, you know, our peoples in Africa who were very connected to the elephant, and that I have maybe a tattoo of an elephant, or there's always something of an elephant, you know.
Yeah.
But nobody ever asks me why all of my journals have an elephant on them. Yeah. And this is, you know, I remember this young man from Africa, and that's what he said. Now I can say that because I've been invited to bring my full self, so my spiritual, physical, mental, emotional self, but also those ancestors. And that is not conventional, I guess, you know, like the typical way that we do things. And that in systems thinking, we call that path dependence, right? That we just do this because it's always been done that way.
Yeah.
And, you know, some of the most liberating practices are for people to break the simplest rules. And that introduces, you know, like in typical introductions, I've heard, in 1 minute, please, let's go around the room because there's 30 people, and introduce yourself in 1 minute. Well, in our practice, you know, introducing ourselves takes a long time. We say our clan, our spirit name, where we're from, and then we'll tell you a story. And if you make room for that, then that's, I think, where that grief comes about, because then people realize that they've grieved the opportunity to bring their full self forward. So every time we break a conventional rule, that creates more compassion, acceptance, you know, bringing your full self to something. The more opportunities you have to do that, your BS meter is really sensitive. So when you sit in a situation now and someone says, in 1 minute, I want you to tell me this, you go, okay, hold on. That I'm not going to accept that anymore. I'm going to bring my full self. So I'm going to break all your rules and introduce myself for, you know, the way I should. So that, you know, is, I think, how people are realizing the grief that they're carrying is when they're shown a different way to do things, shown a more compassionate way to be in the world. They realize that is what they need to release.
Yeah, as you're talking, it's making me think about the disconnection from ourself you know, because we are wearing a mask, we are conforming to these modern rules of not sharing emotion, not, you know, keeping your sad story to yourself or keeping your ancestor story to yourself, because there just isn't time for that in this culture. And just like that disconnection is very much akin to the disconnection from nature. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a disconnection from your very own nature, and how much loss is stored in that. And then when you layer on trauma, intergenerational trauma, collective trauma, colonial trauma from both sides, it becomes heavy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. And I think the collective healing processes that support community building, and that you see, you know, I've heard so many people throughout 2020 when they've been brought into conversations where their full selves are welcomed and they hear each other's story, like check-ins, for example, you know. Check-ins used to be fairly straightforward, and now a check-in can run the first hour of the meeting because people are sharing the roller coaster we've all been on, right? The anxiety and the grief, and then you go through a state of hopelessness, and then you go through a state of joy, and then you go back into, you know, hopeless again, and you watch everything happening in the world. It tends to be, you know, quite overwhelming. So I think the collective healing and the opportunity or the invitation to participate in collective healing helps people realize that we are experiencing a lot of the same things.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that's important, because you do feel often, I think people feel, at least I've gone through that, to feel like, am I the only one that's experiencing this? You know, I had extreme COVID-induced anxiety this past summer, and I had never experienced anything like that before. That kind of generalized like terror of death and dying and everything that was going on around me. And at the same time, I was, you know, hosting circles and talking about it. But it wasn't. It took a while for me to process what was happening, because anxiety can also be very physiological. Mm-hmm. You know, your body feels it. And for me, having our regular gung fu cha, which is like a Chinese tea ceremony, tea service, actually not a ceremony, having that daily with my family, because we're, you know, in our bubble still, we haven't seen anybody outside of our bubble, and just the presencing of making the tea, preparing it, you know, sipping tea. And so I've brought that into the work I do, where we do collective tea ceremonies. And when you drink tea, it's considered good form for slurp. And so we were hosting sessions with people from around the world where we would ask them to unmute themselves and slurp together. And so we just did that last week with a group of about 80 people. And we get really beautiful feedback, that they feel good, just, especially on Zoom. You know, we're all doing these things on Zoom, but the elders have talked about this technology as connecting us spiritually. So they're not as wrapped up in the limitations of Zoom and this. If you can make a spiritual connection, because the spirit realm is not physical. There's not, you're not, you know, you're not in New Mexico and I'm not in Ontario. In the spirit world, where we're connecting, our minds are connecting and our spirits are connecting, we're in the same place. So that was a beautiful teaching, because I was, you know, seeing and hearing pushback from the virtual spaces that we're gathering now, but it is an opportunity to just explore what that's like to connect very deeply spiritually in these online platforms.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Comes with intentionality too, right? You know, that this is not just me sitting here in front of a screen. It's like, no, actually, this is an opportunity for a really powerful connection of another kind. Yeah. That's tremendous. Can you talk a little bit more about tea as medicine?
Yeah, so my husband Sly took some tea sommelier courses last year. I had no idea there were tea sommeliers, like wine sommeliers, and there are water sommeliers. And in taking those courses, he was just bringing all kinds of tea into the home, and I started to learn about teaware and tea culture, and you know, like tea comes from Camellia sinensis, the plant. Most of the things that we think of tea are actually herbal infusions.
Right.
So Labrador tea, cedar tea, those are not actual teas according to the plant tea. But all of those are ways that we can connect to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
The beautiful thing about tea ceremonies and the way that we've been practicing is that the purpose of it is to drink tea. It doesn't have like an ulterior motive. I mean, it does, you know, give you a sense of presencing, being in the moment, which we know people who are experiencing deep trauma and are triggered by something and have a physiological response that, you know,
Yes.
deep breathing and presencing is really effective. For me, having anxiety, when I was drinking tea and having tea ceremonies with my family, there was a reprieve from anxiety. And then I started to really understand tea as medicine. And it does have, I mean, there are herbal properties for different teas. So there is that kind of idea that you can drink this kind of tea for, you know, physical ailments. But I'm talking more in our practice around tea as healing as well, because it brings people together. And so, and it slows people down. I think that's really an important aspect to it, or element, particularly on Zoom. And so we've kind of, we set it up so there's an overhead camera and there's, you know, there's different things that people can actually see. And then taking the folks last week through the tea ceremony, we often get feedback from people who say they have not sat in community, and that doesn't require that you have to do anything. Like, you can turn off your camera. We just encourage you to make a cup of tea with us. So have your kettle ready, have your, you know, your favorite cup or bowl if you're using bowls, and then we introduce people to some of the practices like tea pets. You know, what's a little tea pet? The tea bowls, and we have tasting sets, and so we take people through tastings. So there's a number of different things. Matcha, you know, how do you prepare matcha? How do you drink that? And then there's the medicinal qualities of all of them, which is really nice, the antioxidants. And so, yeah, we have now created tea cohorts, tea talks, tea tastings. Tea talks are an opportunity to drink tea together first, in the first half hour, and then the second half hour, just have a conversation with a group of, you know, folks around sometimes a specific topic. Other times it's just to get together and have tea.
That's amazing. I love it. That's so beautiful. And I'm so excited for the tea service that we're going to get to experience with you live. That's going to be really great. One other thing that I want to bring up and I want to ask about is, and maybe we've already touched on it, but maybe you can unpack it just a little bit for the lay people among us, which is me. Unpack it for me. Relational systems thinking for facing the future. We are all here at a precipice. We are ready, willing, able, hopefully feeling able to create a new paradigm out of everything that we've been learning. The great, as you say, the act of great and deep teaching that 2020 provided us. We're facing the future. How can relational systems thinking aid us? What does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, in my academic work, I've been studying resilience thinking, complexity theory, systems thinking. So really, you know, just kind of understanding the interconnectedness of the world. But that practice, sort of the conventional practice of it, can be, as I mentioned, like a very anthropocentric, very kind of in the head, right?
Yeah.
Connecting head and heart is an important aspect of that.
Yeah.
But taking it maybe a little bit of a step further is that if we center relationships, which Indigenous cultures and languages, you know, I've talked about, center relationships. We're a relational,
yes,
you know, kind of way of knowing and being in the world. If we are in relationship with Mother Earth, with the land, you know, with the environment around us, if we're in relationship with each other, but we privilege that, instead of that being secondary or that being the blind spot, you know, for some systems practices. In other words, there's tools. So, you know, here, you know, use this tool. And then you're taught the tool and it helps you understand systems and complexity and kind of the different properties of complex systems, which can be very big, like mapping, systems mapping. But what we've been doing is in, you might say, decolonizing systems mapping or mapping. We decolonize the process of how to do it, the underlying values we look at and examine, and then we kind of reintroduce it to our practice in a way that centers relationships. And it centers the relationships that we have spiritually, as well as, the kind of person-to-person relationships and things like that. So I've called it relational systems thinking. That's kind of like coming out of my research and my work. And if you do that, then you ask different questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you measure things differently. I've been working with a lot of philanthropists, for example, on social impact and key performance indicators and metrics, because we tend to go to the scientific method in quantification. So you can measure your impact in the world, for example, by counting how many of something. How many workshops did you do? How many people tuned into your Zoom call? But how do you measure the one person whose life fundamentally shifted?
Right.
From that moment on, and they went and did something in the world amazing.
Right.
You can't quantify that. So that's what relational systems thinking is that, understanding also what we call paradoxical implications, like the side effects of something. If you are just counting, I'm going to introduce this technology to 1,000 people. If your success is measured by the 1,000, because that's what you set out to do, what about the side effects of that technology brought something negative to those people, right? Or potentially something really wonderful.
Right.
That's what relational systems thinking is. It's making sure you understand all of the relationships, all of the moving parts, including the unseen. That's the really key part of it. It's not just about the seen, the measurable or the material. It's about the spiritual aspect of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and it's applied in the kind of practice of systems change. What are your leverage points? Where are you intervening in the system?
Right.
And how are you telling that story? So we really privilege a lot of storytelling in our work as well.
Absolutely. So to kind of break it down even further, what I'm hearing and intuiting from what you're saying is that it is really a way for us to be in deep inquiry and examination of how we are relating, not only to the people in our lives, but how are we relating to culture? How are we relating to ideas and concepts and belief systems? How are we relating to the land, the sun, the moon, the wind, all of these things? And to understand that we are in this beautiful dance, these layers of relationships, and that also, what's the word I'm trying to say? Intensifies, it's not quite it, but cements this idea of our interconnectedness, that we are really part of all of these we are in relationship with all of these parts of our quote unquote reality. And the question is, are we in right relationship? And how can we be in right relationship for not only my best and highest good, but also for yours, for the land, for future generations? It's a powerful place of inquiry to think about that. I thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. I think I was just going to say that, when I was talking about kind of impacts and measurement, what the elders will ask, and I've shared this with people, and after you have a workshop or after you have a conversation, what song came to your mind, and like a ceremonial song. That's the kind of questions to be asking, is like, did you hear a song? Did a teaching come to mind? Did you dream? Did this cause you to dream? And then we have ceremonies to interpret dreams and talk about dreams. And so dreams as a valid source of knowledge or way of knowing has been denigrated in certain, like Western science, for example. You don't show up and say, I wrote a thesis based on my dream. But I started Turtle Island Institute based on my dream that I dreamt of a small turtle walking into a lodge. And I knew it wasn't a sweat lodge, and so I didn't know what kind of lodge it was, and that was 8 years ago. And it took this long to go into processes of inquiry, and those processes include ceremonies and fasting and feasting and, you know, connecting to the spirit world to ask, what was that dream about? And for different people to come into my life to shed light on that as well. And so I think maybe I'll just, you know, kind of leave you with this idea that it really takes a lot of time. You know, I have a relative that's been working on a specific type of healing lodge for 27 years.
Mm.
I've been, I was asked when I was 19, offered the responsibility and the honor of carrying a pawagan, a pipe, and it's a healing pipe. So I've been a pipe carrier since I was 19, so 30 years. I've been learning how to do that. And that's why we revere elders so much, because, you know, our older folks, they have spent a lifetime learning, and they can impart that as a gift. And, you know, that's really all I think I am in some ways, not all, but I mean, that's the important aspect of what I do is to be a bridge to the elders that all stand behind me, that have taught me how to, you know, engage with the world in a way that our ancestors might be proud.
Mm. That's beautiful. And we are so grateful to you for being that bridge and sharing all of this with us. It has been such a delight. I could talk to you for hours and hours about how we're going to change culture and shift paradigms and really bring deep healing to the collective. And so this is a beautiful start, and I'm just so grateful to you. And before I forget, you do have something beautiful to share with our audience, right? It's a video. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the video, when we were before COVID, like everybody else, we were doing our work a certain way, which was on the land. And I had invited a number of people up to Treaty 3, which is in northwestern Ontario, here in Canada, to Kanachiwanung, which are the Manitou Mounds. They're 10,000-year-old burial mounds. Because I thought if we're going to connect with ancestors, you know, being the way humans are with our rational minds, what if they were right there? You know, what if we could see them right there? And because it's also a place of ceremony, it's a very powerful place, and that the spirits are there. And so we asked a film crew to come with us, and we filmed a couple of videos. So this is one of the videos that we filmed there, and it's called Gichiga Kinuamatawin. It is called The Act of Great or Deep Teaching. And it talks about knowing who you are, you know, where you come from, so that you know where you're going. And so it really, you know, speaks to what we were talking about today. So, and it's a private Vimeo. We share that in our teaching lodge, and we share that with people that, you know, we engage in, but you can't kind of Google it and find it. So, so I'm sharing that as a gift to everyone here.
Thank you so much. And I will just say the videos that I have seen produced, you know, through Turtle Island Institute have been incredibly beautiful, just stunning to witness, and very emotionally striking. So I definitely encourage everyone to watch it. They're just amazing. So Melanie, I thank you so much. I can't wait for the tea service. Excited to slurp tea with you. And I'm just so grateful to you for being part of this journey with us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.